Well, here on The Story, we like to keep an eye on what's going on with local news ecosystem here in the Northwest. Often we talk about a legacy news outlet closing or being bought by an out-of-state company who immediately starts cutting staff. But there are a lot of people trying to revive local news. Tomorrow, a new outlet is launching called Lookout Eugene Springfield. It's an online-only news platform covering, you guessed it, Eugene and Springfield. The publisher, Ken Doctor, modeled it after an outlet he built in Santa Cruz, California, which, get this, last year won a coveted Pulitzer Prize. He says he chose to launch in Eugene after a U of O journalism professor approached him to talk about how much the legacy paper there has declined in recent years.
And I remember how good the Register Guard was, one of the best papers in the country, really, as an independent daily. And when it was bought by Gatehouse and then Gannett merger, it declined very rapidly. If you look at Eugene, it is a city that really cares about news.
The paper, Doctor says he's still calling it a newspaper, even though it won't be printed on paper, will be free for 90 days, and then some sections will be behind a paywall. But he says there will always be lots of free content. Now, figuring out how to pay for news production in the digital age has been the big question for news outlets large and small, new and old. Advertising revenue in recent years tends to go toward big tech companies. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But some recent new outlets have been nonprofits, like the Oregon Capitol Chronicle. Others have tried to find new agencies, or audiences rather, online. Doctor says the funding model for Lookout is more business-driven, but he thinks people will pay for good journalism.
It's really the same model as all good journalism has been. It's got to be without fear or favor, strong accountability journalism, but also food and arts and across the board, essentially what a good newspaper gives you. It needs, number two, it needs capital. It needs investment. It doesn't need it doesn't need quote unquote support. It needs investment like any business. And what I figured from the beginning, and it was contrary to what many people have believed in this business, that it needed to be big enough and the staff needed to be professionally paid, that it needed a lot of capital.
He says they've raised $3.6 million already and hired a staff of 18, 15 of whom are journalists, some with decades of experience. The Lookout will also be hosting weekly listening sessions with members to get to know their audience, and they're also planning an annual party. And funding for local news was a big topic in Salem today at a public hearing on a bill that would charge those big tech companies for using information from local news outlets. Right now, companies like Google and Meta are sharing articles from local news on their own platforms, and they get that ad revenue. Meanwhile, the news outlets are making cuts, in part because they're not getting that money. But Senate Bill 686 would require tech companies to pay online news providers to use their content. How much is up to the news outlet and the tech company to decide together. 90% would go to outlets and 10% would fund a new Oregon Civic Information Consortium, which would do research on media and technology. Outlets with more journalists on staff would get more, so it's supposed to encourage hiring. Several lawmakers testified in support today, including KGW alum and Oregon State Senator Lou Frederick.
72% of the newspaper staff was lost in Oregon between 2017 and 2022. When I went to work, while I was working as a television reporter at Channel 8, there were 100 people in the newsroom. There are about 30 now. A little closer to home, at one point, the press credentials for the state capitol had 65 people in 1995. There are now 15. Basically, we're not being covered. People do not know what's really going on here.
Research shows that when communities lose journalism, it costs taxpayers more because fewer people are watching over government spending, and misinformation spreads because people get their information from social media and less trustworthy places. The chief sponsor of SB 686 is Senator Con Pham, who says having healthy news outlets is important to democracy.
I would say even as a legislator, I depend on local journalism to do my job, to be able to know what is happening in my community, what's happening at the local level, the city council. It's so important to hold powerful entities accountable. And so as part of my democracy, a healthy democracy platform, I deeply am deeply committed to ensuring that we're protecting and preserving our local journalism landscape.
But there was opposition from people saying the bill would hurt local news, especially smaller outlets and those in rural areas, and that it was likely to get tied up in litigation over free speech concerns. One of those was the guy you just heard from, Ken Doctor, who says he's afraid it would be challenged on free speech grounds and get tied up in court for a long time.
But there's a lot of publishers in the state, small newspaper publishers are ailing. They need help now. And there is no way that this bill is going to provide help now, given the litigation that is sure to follow.
For their part, Google says they support local news organizations with funding and resources, and they create products for journalists to use, saying they're committed to ensuring every community has access to quality information it needs. Senate Bill 686 had its first public hearing today in the Senate committee. No vote was taken today, but we're going to keep you posted.